The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished marble floors of Buckingham Palace as King Charles III walked slowly through the corridors that had once echoed with his mother's footsteps. 3 months had passed since Queen Elizabeth II's funeral, yet the weight of the crown still felt foreign upon his head. The transition from Prince of Wales to King had been swift, but the emotional journey of losing his beloved mother continued to unfold in unexpected ways. Charles paused before the ornate doors of the Queen's former private study, a room that had remained untouched since her passing. The palace staff had been instructed to leave everything exactly as it was, preserving the space as a shrine to the longest reigning monarch in British history. Today, however, was different. Today, he would finally face the daunting task of going through his mother's personal effects. The King's private secretary, Sir Edward Whitmore, approached with measured steps, his usually composed demeanor showing signs of the strain that had affected everyone in the royal household since the Queen's death. In his hands, he carried a leather-bound portfolio that seemed to weigh more than its physical mass suggested. "Your Majesty," Sir Edward began, his voice carrying the careful tone reserved for sensitive matters, "the Queen's solicitors have requested an urgent meeting. There appears to be some documents that require immediate attention." Charles turned from the window where he had been gazing out at the gardens his mother had loved so dearly. The rose bushes were beginning their autumn transition, their vibrant colors slowly fading just as the Queen's presence seemed to be fading from the palace walls. "What sort of documents, Edward? I thought we had reviewed all the necessary legal papers weeks ago." Sir Edward's hesitation was barely perceptible, but Charles had known him for over 2 decades and could read the subtle signs of discomfort in his aide's manner. The solicitors mentioned something about additional clauses in Her late Majesty's will. Apparently, there were sealed instructions that were only to be opened 3 months after her passing. The words hung in the air between them like a heavy fog. Charles felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same sensation he had experienced during those final days at Balmoral when it became clear that his mother's time was drawing to a close. The Queen had been meticulous in her planning, even in death, and the thought of unknown provisions in her will filled him with both curiosity and dread. "Very well," Charles said finally, straightening his shoulders in a gesture that had become second nature since accepting the crown. "Arrange for the meeting this afternoon. And, Edward, ensure that Prince William is present. If these documents concern the monarchy's future, the heir should be informed immediately." As Sir Edward departed to make the arrangements, Charles found himself drawn back to the window. The October afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting the palace grounds in a golden glow that reminded him of countless childhood memories. He thought of his mother's unwavering dedication to duty, her careful consideration of every decision that might affect the crown or the Commonwealth. Whatever these sealed instructions contained, he knew they would not be trivial. The hours until the meeting seemed to pass both quickly and slowly, as if time itself were uncertain about the revelations to come. Charles spent the morning reviewing state papers, but his concentration was fractured, his thoughts repeatedly returning to the mysterious documents that awaited his attention. Prince William arrived at the palace just as the afternoon tea was being served in the King's private dining room. The father and son embraced warmly, but Charles could see the questions in William's eyes. The younger prince had inherited his grandmother's perceptive nature and could sense when something significant was brewing beneath the surface of royal protocol. "Father, what's this about additional provisions in grandmother's will?" William asked as they settled into the comfortable chairs that had been arranged around the fireplace. "I thought everything had been settled according to her wishes." Charles poured the tea himself, a small gesture that spoke to the informal nature of their relationship despite the formal titles they now carried. "I know as little as you do, William. Your grandmother was always thorough, perhaps more thorough than any of us realized. We'll know more once the solicitors arrive." The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 4 o'clock just as Sir Edward announced the arrival of the Queen's legal team. Led by Sir Malcolm Richardson, the elderly solicitor who had served the royal family for over 4 decades, the group entered the room with the solemnity befitting the occasion. Sir Malcolm, his white hair neatly combed and his traditional black suit immaculate despite his 83 years, carried with him a sealed envelope bearing the royal seal. The sight of his mother's personal seal, pressed into the red wax with the same authority she had wielded in life, made Charles's breath catch momentarily. "Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness," Sir Malcolm began, his voice carrying the weight of years spent handling the most sensitive affairs of the crown. What I am about to share with you was sealed by Her late Majesty's explicit instructions, not to be opened until this date. The Queen was most specific about the timing. Charles nodded for him to continue, while William leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The room fell silent except for the gentle crackling of the fire and the distant sound of London traffic beyond the palace walls. Sir Malcolm carefully broke the wax seal and unfolded the documents within. His eyes scanned the contents briefly before he looked up at the two men who represented the future of the monarchy. Your Majesty, these provisions concern the distribution of certain personal assets and properties, as well as specific instructions regarding the Duke of Sussex. The mention of Harry caused both Charles and William to exchange glances. Since Harry's departure from royal duties and his move to California with Meghan, family relationships had been strained despite attempts at reconciliation. The Sussexes had not maintained regular contact with the family since the Queen's funeral, and their absence from recent royal events had been noted by both the press and the public. The Queen has left specific instructions regarding Frogmore Cottage and its associated trust fund, Sir Malcolm continued, his professional demeanor not quite masking his own apparent surprise at the contents of the document. Additionally, there are provisions concerning the Duke's future role, should he choose to return to royal duties. Charles felt his heart rate increase as the implications of these words began to sink in. Frogmore Cottage had been renovated at significant expense when Harry and Meghan were married, and the property had become a symbol of their brief time as working royals. The couple had recently been asked to vacate the property, a decision that had caused considerable tension within the family. Please, Malcolm, share the specific provisions, Charles said, his voice steady despite the turmoil he felt building within. Sir Malcolm adjusted his glasses and began to read directly from the Queen's handwritten instructions. I, Elizabeth Regina, do hereby establish that Frogmore Cottage and the associated trust fund of £12 million shall remain available to Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, under the following conditions: that he maintains his residence within the United Kingdom for no less than 6 months per year, that he participates in no fewer than 100 royal engagements annually, and that he ceases all commercial activities that trade upon his royal titles or position. The words seemed to echo in the silence that followed. Charles stared at the fire, processing the implications of his mother's final attempt to bring Harry back into the royal fold. The conditions were specific and demanding, requiring a complete reversal of the life Harry had built in California. William was the first to speak, his voice carrying a mixture of surprise and concern. She's essentially offering him a way back, but only on very specific terms. The commercial activities clause would mean ending his book deals, his media contracts, everything he and Meghan have built in America. Sir Malcolm nodded gravely. There's more, Your Royal Highness. The Queen specified that these provisions would only remain valid for 1 year from the date of this reading. After that time, if the conditions have not been accepted and fulfilled, the cottage and trust fund will be redistributed according to alternative instructions. Charles rose from his chair and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that mirrored his mother's own thoughtful poses. The weight of the decision facing Harry was enormous, but so too was the weight of responsibility now resting on Charles's shoulders to handle this delicate family matter while maintaining the dignity of the crown. Has Harry been informed of these provisions? Charles asked without turning from the window. Not yet, Your Majesty. The Queen's instructions were specific that you should be informed first, and that the decision of how to communicate these provisions to the Duke should rest with you. The afternoon light was fading rapidly now, and Charles could see his reflection in the window glass superimposed over the darkening gardens. He thought of Harry as a young boy, running through these same gardens with William, their laughter echoing off the palace walls. He thought of the proud moment when Harry had served with distinction in Afghanistan, and of the joy on his face on his wedding day. He also thought of the pain and anger that had driven his younger son away from the family he had once served so devotedly. The timing of this revelation is particularly complex, Charles said, finally, turning back to face the room. Harry and Meghan have built a life in California. They have business commitments, personal relationships, and their children are settled in American schools. To accept these conditions would require them to uproot everything they've established. William stood and joined his father by the window. But it's also grandmother's final wish for family unity. She clearly hoped that these generous provisions might encourage Harry to return home, to return to the family and to royal service. Sir Malcolm cleared his throat gently. "Your Majesty, there is one additional provision that I should mention." The Queen specified that if the Duke of Sussex chooses not to accept these conditions, the cottage and trust fund will be established as a charitable foundation in the name of the late Prince Philip, dedicated to supporting military veterans and their families. The mention of his father brought a slight smile to Charles's face despite the gravity of the situation. The Queen's final strategic mind had been at work even in her last days, ensuring that if her attempt at family reconciliation failed, the resources would still serve a meaningful purpose that honored her late husband's memory and supported causes dear to Harry's heart. As the meeting concluded and the solicitors departed with promises to await the King's instructions on how to proceed, Charles and William remained in the room, both lost in their own thoughts about the impossible choice now facing Harry. The fire had burned low, casting dancing shadows across the walls adorned with portraits of previous monarchs who had faced their own family crises and difficult decisions. "What will you tell him, father?" William asked softly. Charles picked up the documents that Sir Malcolm had left behind, feeling the weight of his mother's final words written in her distinctive handwriting. "I will tell him the truth, William. I'll tell him that his grandmother never stopped hoping for his return, and that she believed enough in his sense of duty to offer him one final opportunity to choose the path that serves both his family and his country." The two men stood together in the gathering darkness, both understanding that the next conversation Charles would have with Harry would determine not only the future of the Sussex family but, potentially, the tone of the new reign. The Queen's final gambit was both generous and challenging, offering everything Harry had lost but demanding everything he had gained in return. As Charles prepared to make the most difficult phone call of his reign, he wondered whether his mother's final act of love would bring healing to their fractured family or whether it would force Harry to choose definitively between his old life and his new one, with no possibility of return. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier than it did in that moment, as the new king prepared to deliver news that would change his family's future forever. The California morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sussex home in Montecito, casting geometric patterns across the hardwood floors where Prince Archie played with his toy cars. Meghan Markle sat at the kitchen island, her laptop open as she reviewed the script for an upcoming podcast episode, while Prince Harry stood on the terrace overlooking their carefully manicured gardens, a steaming cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. The past 3 months since his grandmother's funeral had been a whirlwind of conflicting emotions for Harry. The grief of losing the one family member who had always understood him was compounded by the continuing distance from his father and brother. Their brief interactions during the funeral period had been polite but strained, professional courtesy masking years of unresolved hurt and misunderstanding. Harry's phone had been buzzing intermittently throughout the morning, displaying missed calls from a number he recognized as Buckingham Palace. He had been avoiding the calls, assuming they were about routine matters related to his grandmother's estate or perhaps another attempt by palace officials to coordinate some meaningless ceremonial appearance. The thought of returning to the rigid protocols and endless obligations of royal life made his stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. "Darling, your phone keeps ringing," Meghan called from the kitchen, her American accent a comforting reminder of the new life they had built together. "Maybe you should answer it. It might be important." Harry turned from the terrace, watching his wife as she effortlessly balanced her work responsibilities with keeping an eye on their children. Lilibet was napping upstairs while Archie continued his elaborate game involving what appeared to be a royal procession of toy vehicles. The domestic tranquility of their California home stood in stark contrast to the formal grandeur of the palaces where Harry had spent his youth. "It's probably just palace bureaucracy," Harry replied, but, even as he said the words, he felt a nagging sense that something was different about these calls. The frequency and persistence suggested urgency beyond the usual administrative matters. When the phone rang again, Harry finally relented. The caller ID showed Sir Edward Whitmore's direct line, and Harry knew that the King's private secretary would not be calling repeatedly unless the matter was genuinely significant. "Sir Edward," Harry answered, his voice carrying a carefully neutral tone that he had perfected during years of navigating palace politics. "Your Royal Highness, thank you for taking my call. I trust you and the family are well." Sir Edward's formal politeness was tinged with something Harry couldn't quite identify: nervousness, perhaps, or anticipation. "We're all fine, thank you. What can I do for you, Edward? Sir, His Majesty has requested that I arrange a private video call with you at your earliest convenience. There are matters concerning Her late Majesty's final wishes that require your immediate attention. Harry felt his pulse quicken. His grandmother had been remarkably thorough in her planning, and most of her estate matters had been settled quickly after the funeral. The mention of additional wishes that required his personal attention seemed unusual. What sort of matters, Edward? I thought everything had been finalized weeks ago. I'm afraid I'm not at liberty to discuss the details over the phone, sir. His Majesty specifically requested that the conversation take place directly between you. Would this afternoon be convenient? I understand the time difference makes scheduling challenging. Harry glanced at his watch, calculating the 8-hour difference between California and London. An afternoon call from London would mean early morning in Montecito, but the urgency in Sir Edward's voice made it clear that delays would not be welcome. Very well. Shall we say 6 a.m. my time? That would be 2 in the afternoon for Father. Perfect, sir. I'll arrange for a secure video connection. Thank you for your flexibility. As Harry ended the call, he found Meghan watching him with the concerned expression that had become increasingly familiar over the past few years. She had developed an acute ability to read the subtle signs of stress that appeared whenever palace business intruded on their carefully constructed new life. Palace business, she asked, closing her laptop and giving him her full attention. Harry nodded, running his hand through his hair in a gesture that betrayed his anxiety despite his attempts to appear calm. Father wants to speak with me urgently about something related to Granny's will. Edward wouldn't give any details over the phone. Meghan moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his arm in a gesture of support that had become second nature after years of facing royal drama together. Could it be about Frogmore Cottage? The reports about us being asked to vacate were all over the British press last month. Maybe, Harry said, though something about Sir Edward's tone suggested the matter was more complex than simple property arrangements. Whatever it is, it's significant enough that Father wanted to speak with me directly rather than handling it through lawyers. The rest of the day passed slowly, with Harry finding it difficult to concentrate on his usual activities. He spent time playing with Archie in the garden, his son's innocent laughter providing temporary distraction from his growing apprehension about the upcoming call. Meghan had rearranged her afternoon schedule to be available for moral support, understanding from experience that conversations with the palace rarely went smoothly. As evening approached, Harry found himself thinking about his grandmother more intensely than he had since the funeral. The Queen had possessed an almost supernatural ability to orchestrate events from behind the scenes, and her influence had often extended far beyond what was publicly visible. If she had left specific instructions that required his attention, those instructions would not be casual suggestions. That night, Harry barely slept, his mind racing through possibilities and scenarios. When his alarm sounded at 5:30 in the morning, he was already awake, staring at the ceiling as Meghan slept peacefully beside him. He slipped quietly from bed, made coffee in the dark kitchen, and settled into his home office to await what would undoubtedly be a life-changing conversation. At exactly 6 a.m., Harry's computer chimed with an incoming video call from Buckingham Palace. He accepted the connection and found himself looking at his father, who appeared to be sitting in the same private study where they had held so many difficult conversations over the years. "Harry," King Charles said, his voice carrying the mixture of affection and formality that characterized their relationship since Harry's departure from royal duties. "Thank you for making time for this conversation. I know the hour is early for you." "Father," Harry replied, noting the weariness in Charles's eyes that seemed to have deepened since the funeral. "Sir Edward mentioned something about Granny's will. I thought everything had been settled." Charles leaned back in his chair, and Harry could see him gathering himself for what was clearly a significant revelation. "Your grandmother left sealed instructions that were only to be opened 3 months after her passing. William and I learned about them yesterday, and the contents directly concern you and your family's future." Harry felt his stomach tighten with apprehension. "What kind of instructions?" "Harry, your grandmother never stopped hoping that you would return to royal service, to the family. Her final provisions include an offer that I believe she hoped would encourage you to reconsider your current path." As Charles began to explain the details of the Queen's offer, Frogmore Cottage, the £12 million trust fund, the specific conditions for Harry's return to royal duties, Harry felt the world shifting around him. The generosity of the financial provision was staggering, but the conditions attached to it were equally daunting. "She's asking me to give up everything we've built here," Harry said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "The media contracts, the book deal, the production company, all of it." Charles nodded solemnly. "She's offering you a complete return to your former position, Harry, but only if you're willing to commit fully. Half measures were never your grandmother's way." Harry stood and walked to the window of his home office, looking out at the gardens where his children played daily, where he had found peace after years of struggling with his role in the royal family. The life they had built in California wasn't just about financial independence, it was about freedom from the suffocating protocols and constant scrutiny that had driven him to the brink of despair. "The children," Harry said, thinking of Archie and Lilibet, who had never known life under the intense media scrutiny that had defined Harry's childhood. "They're American citizens. They have friends here, activities, a normal life. Asking them to give that up for the fishbowl of royal life." "I understand the magnitude of what's being asked," Charles replied, his voice gentle but serious. "This isn't a decision that can be made quickly or easily. But, Harry, this is your grandmother's final gesture toward family unity. She believes deeply in your potential to serve the crown and the Commonwealth with distinction." Harry turned back to face the camera, seeing in his father's expression the weight of expectations that had defined their family for generations. "How long do I have to decide?" "1 year from yesterday's reading. If the conditions aren't accepted and fulfilled by then, the cottage and trust fund will be used to establish a charitable foundation in grandfather Philip's name, supporting military veterans." The mention of his grandfather brought a slight smile to Harry's face despite his turmoil. The Queen's final strategic mind had ensured that even rejection would serve a purpose dear to Harry's heart, supporting the military community that had given his life meaning during his service years. "Father, I need to discuss this with Meghan. This decision affects all of us, not just me. The children would have to give up their schools, their friends, their entire world as they know it." "Of course. Take the time you need, but, Harry." Charles paused, his expression softening. "Whatever you decide, know that you'll always be my son. This offer doesn't change my love for you or my desire to have you in my life. It's simply an opportunity that your grandmother wanted you to have." After the call ended, Harry sat alone in his office as the California sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the floor. The weight of the decision before him felt almost unbearable. On one side lay financial security, family reconciliation, and a return to the purposeful service that had once given his life meaning. On the other side lay the freedom, independence, and family happiness they had fought so hard to achieve. When Meghan appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, her presence immediately provided the grounding he desperately needed. She sat beside him as he explained the Queen's offer, watching his face carefully as he outlined the impossible choice before them. £12 million, Meghan said softly, processing the magnitude of the financial offer. "That's generational wealth, Harry. Security for Archie and Lilibet that would last their entire lives." "But, at what cost?" Harry replied, his voice heavy with the weight of years of palace trauma. "You know what that life was like, Meghan. The constant scrutiny, the rigid protocols, the way they tried to control every aspect of our existence. We fought so hard to get away from all of that." Meghan was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the arm of her chair as she considered the implications. "The Queen obviously believed that we could make a difference if we returned. She wouldn't have made such a generous offer if she didn't think we could serve effectively. Or she was manipulating us one final time," Harry said bitterly, though he immediately regretted the harsh words. His grandmother had been many things, but manipulative wasn't one of them. Strategic, certainly, but always with the best interests of the monarchy and the family at heart. "Harry," Meghan said gently, "what do you actually want? Not what you think you should want, not what would make your family happy or angry, but what would genuinely fulfill you?" It was the question that cut to the heart of his internal struggle. Harry closed his eyes, trying to sort through the tangle of emotions, obligations, and desires that had defined his adult life. The truth was complicated and painful. Part of him had never stopped missing the sense of purpose that came from royal service, the feeling that his work mattered to people across the Commonwealth. "I don't know anymore," he admitted. "I love the military work, the conservation projects, the way I could use my position to help people. But I also love this life we've built, the freedom to make our own choices, to protect our children from the machinery of the palace." As the morning progressed and their children woke up, filling the house with the cheerful chaos of family life, Harry found himself observing everything with new eyes. Archie's carefree laughter as he played with his toys, Lilibet's innocent curiosity about the world around her, all of it suddenly felt fragile and precious in light of the choice before them. The decision would reshape not only their own lives but the future of their children, the trajectory of the monarchy, and Harry's relationship with his family. As he watched Meghan expertly juggle breakfast preparations with work calls, he realized that whatever choice they made would require courage, sacrifice, and a leap of faith into an uncertain future. The Queen's final gambit had succeeded in forcing them to confront the fundamental question they had been avoiding since leaving royal life, whether their happiness lay in the freedom they had fought to achieve or in the service they had left behind. The autumn winds swept across the grounds of Frogmore Cottage as Harry stood before the Georgian facade that had once represented hope and new beginnings for his young family. 6 weeks had passed since the revelation of his grandmother's final conditions, 6 weeks of intense discussions, sleepless nights, and careful consideration of a decision that would alter the trajectory of multiple lives. Meghan stood beside him, her hand intertwined with his as they gazed at the cottage that had been their first married home. The building looked smaller than Harry remembered, its cream-colored walls and elegant windows somehow diminished by time and distance. The extensive renovations they had overseen with such excitement now seemed like echoes from another lifetime. "It feels strange being back," Meghan said softly, her voice carrying the weight of complicated emotions. "Like visiting a house where someone else used to live." Harry nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The cottage held memories of their early married bliss, the excitement of expecting Archie, the hope they had shared for a future of meaningful royal service. But it also held the shadows of what came after, the media harassment, the family tensions, the growing realization that the institution they sought to serve might never fully accept them. They had returned to England quietly, staying at a private hotel in London while they conducted what Meghan had termed their reconnaissance mission. The decision to even consider the Queen's offer had required extensive negotiations with their American business partners, delicate conversations with their children's schools, and painful honesty about what they truly wanted from their lives. "Daddy, is this where we used to live?" Archie asked, his small hand tugging on Harry's jacket. At 4 years old, he retained only fragmentary memories of their time in England, most of them overshadowed by the chaos of their departure. "Yes, buddy," Harry replied, lifting his son so he could get a better view of the cottage. "This was our first house together as a family." Lilibet, now walking confidently and chattering in the mixed accent that reflected her transatlantic upbringing, toddled around the garden with the fearless curiosity of a 2-year-old. To her, this was simply another new place to explore, unmarked by the complex history that made this visit so emotionally charged for her parents. Inside the cottage, which had been maintained in pristine condition by the Crown Estate, every room held memories that seemed to transport Harry back in time. The kitchen where he had nervously prepared breakfast the morning after their wedding, the sitting room where they had shared quiet evenings planning their charitable foundation, the nursery where they had dreamed of raising their children in service to something greater than themselves. "The Queen really did think of everything," Meghan observed as they explored the upper floors. The cottage had been updated with additional security features and modern technology that would be necessary if they chose to return to active royal duties. She must have been planning this for months, maybe even years. Harry ran his fingers along the windowsill in what had once been his study, looking out at the gardens where his grandmother had sometimes walked when she visited them during their brief period as working royals. She was always 10 steps ahead of everyone else. "I think she understood better than any of us what it would take to make a return possible." The financial security offered by the £12 million trust fund was undeniably attractive, especially as they considered their children's education and future opportunities. But, more than the money, it was the chance to reconnect with a sense of purpose that had been gnawing at Harry since their departure from royal life. Their California existence was comfortable and autonomous, but Harry had found himself increasingly restless as he watched world events unfold from the sidelines. The military withdrawal from Afghanistan, global climate challenges, the ongoing Commonwealth transitions, all issues where he felt his experience and position could make a meaningful difference. "I've been thinking about what you said," Meghan said as they sat in the cottage's sitting room while their children played in the garden under the watchful eye of their security detail. "About missing the sense of purpose that came with royal service. I've been missing it too, more than I expected." Harry looked at her with surprise. Meghan had borne the brunt of the media criticism during their time as working royals, facing scrutiny and harassment that had ultimately driven them away from royal life. Her admission that she too felt the pull of renewed service was unexpected. "The projects we were working on before we left," she continued, "the women's empowerment initiatives, the education programs in the Commonwealth, we were just getting started. Sometimes I wonder what we might have accomplished if we had stayed and fought through the difficulties instead of walking away." It was an acknowledgement that neither of them had been willing to make during the heat of their departure, when the pain of family rejection and media harassment had made leaving feel like the only viable option. But time and distance had provided perspective, and the Queen's offer had forced them to reconsider whether their departure had been the only solution to their problems. "The conditions are significant," Harry said, reviewing in his mind the requirements that would govern their return. 100 royal engagements per year would mean a substantial commitment to public service, while the 6-month UK residency requirement would fundamentally alter their family's lifestyle. "But they're not impossible," Meghan replied. "We could maintain the Montecito house for the months we're not required to be here. The children could experience both cultures, both educational systems. They could grow up understanding their heritage while still maintaining their American connections." The practical logistics of splitting their time between two countries were complex but manageable, especially with the resources the trust fund would provide. More challenging was the question of whether they could successfully navigate the royal protocol and family dynamics that had proved so problematic during their first attempt at royal service. "William and Catherine have invited us to dinner tomorrow," Harry said, referring to a conversation he had had with his brother earlier that morning. "I think Father has asked them to help smooth the way if we decide to return." The relationship between the brothers had remained strained despite occasional attempts at reconciliation. The success of any return to royal duties would depend significantly on their ability to work together effectively, to present a united front for the monarchy's future. "How do you feel about seeing them again?" Meghan asked, knowing that family dinners with the Wales family had been sources of both joy and tension in the past. "Nervous," Harry admitted. "But also hopeful. We all loved Granny, and we all want to honor her memory. Maybe that shared commitment can help us move past the personal issues that have divided us." That evening, as they put their children to bed in the cottage that might once again become their home, Harry found himself thinking about the conversation he had had with his father the previous week. King Charles had been careful not to pressure Harry toward any particular decision, but his hope for family reconciliation had been evident in every word. "The monarchy needs you, Harry," Charles had said during their private meeting at Clarence House. "Not just for the work you can do, but for what your return would represent. The institution must evolve to remain relevant, and your perspective, your experiences outside the palace walls, could be invaluable in that evolution." It was an acknowledgement that Harry's departure had cost the monarchy more than just his service. His critique of royal protocols and his advocacy for modernization had resonated with younger generations who saw traditional monarchy as increasingly irrelevant. His return, if managed successfully, could bridge generational and cultural divides that threatened the institution's future. "I've been researching the charities we could work with," Meghan said as they settled into the cottage's sitting room after the children were asleep. "The veterans' organizations, the mental health initiatives, the environmental groups. There's so much meaningful work we could accomplish with the platform that royal status provides." Harry smiled, recognizing in her voice the same enthusiasm that had attracted him when they first met. Meghan's passion for social justice and her strategic mind had been perfectly suited to royal service, even when the institution had struggled to accommodate her different approach to charitable work. The media attention would be intense, he warned, knowing that their return would generate global interest and scrutiny that could easily become overwhelming. "But we're older now, more experienced," she replied. "We know what to expect, and we have better support systems. The Queen's conditions actually provide protection by requiring our commercial activities to end. It eliminates the criticism about trading on royal titles for financial gain. The elimination of their commercial ventures, the Netflix contracts, book deals, and media partnerships would mean giving up millions in potential income, but it would also remove one of the primary sources of family tension and public criticism that had complicated their post-royal existence." As they discussed the practicalities of a potential return, both Harry and Meghan found themselves increasingly excited about the possibilities that royal service could provide. The chance to work on global issues with the resources and platform that only royal status could provide was genuinely appealing. "There's something else," Harry said, producing a letter that had arrived that afternoon via royal courier. "Father sent this. It's from some of the Commonwealth leaders we worked with before we left. They're encouraging our return." The letter, signed by prime ministers and governors general across the Commonwealth, expressed support for Harry and Meghan's potential return to royal service. The testimonials spoke to the impact their work had made during their brief time as working royals and the projects that had been left incomplete after their departure. "They remember the girls' education initiative in Rwanda," Meghan said, reading over the letter. "And the mental health programs in the Caribbean. We were making real progress on these issues." For Harry, the most meaningful endorsement came from a group of military veterans who had worked with his Invictus Games Foundation. Their letter spoke to the gap that his departure had created in advocacy for wounded service members and their families. "These are the people we were meant to serve," Harry said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not the palace courtiers or the media critics, but the people who needed our help and platform to make their voices heard." As the evening progressed and they continued to discuss the implications of the Queen's offer, both Harry and Meghan found themselves gravitating toward acceptance of the conditions. The path forward would not be easy, requiring significant sacrifices and lifestyle changes, but the potential for meaningful service was undeniable. "I want to say yes," Meghan said finally, her voice carrying both determination and nervousness. "I want to honor the Queen's faith in us and see if we can make this work better the second time around." Harry looked at his wife, seeing in her expression the same commitment to service that had originally drawn him to royal duty. "Then, we'll say yes," he replied, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders as the decision crystallized. "We'll accept Granny's offer and see if we can build the life she envisioned for us." The decision made, they spent the rest of the evening planning the logistics of their return, discussing how to handle the media announcement, coordinate with palace officials, and prepare their children for the major life change ahead. The cottage that had once represented their departure from royal life would now symbolize their return to service, their commitment to honoring the Queen's final wish for family unity and dedicated service to the Commonwealth. Outside, the autumn wind continued to sweep across the grounds of Frogmore Cottage, but, inside, the Sussex family began planning for a future that would blend their California independence with their British heritage, their personal happiness with their public duty, their desire for privacy with their commitment to service. The grand ballroom of Buckingham Palace glittered under the light of 1,000 crystal chandeliers as distinguished guests from across the Commonwealth gathered for what the palace had announced as a special reception celebrating renewed royal service. 6 months had passed since Harry and Meghan's decision to accept the Queen's conditions, and tonight marked their formal return to active royal duties with their first major state function. Harry stood beside his father, both men resplendent in formal evening wear, watching as Meghan moved gracefully through the crowd of diplomats, charity leaders, and government officials. Her burgundy silk gown, chosen to complement the palace's traditional decor while maintaining her distinctive personal style, had already generated positive coverage in the international press that had gathered to document this historic evening. "She looks magnificent," King Charles observed, his voice carrying the pride and relief that had characterized his demeanor since his younger son's return to the royal fold. "You both do. Your grandmother would be so pleased to see this evening." Harry nodded, feeling the truth of those words in his bones. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of activity as they had worked to fulfill the Queen's conditions while rebuilding their relationships within the royal family. The transition had not been without challenges, but tonight's reception represented the successful culmination of their efforts to reclaim their place in royal service. The guest list for the evening reflected the global scope of the work that Harry and Meghan had resumed since their return. Commonwealth leaders who had worked with them on previous initiatives mingled with representatives from the charitable organizations they had committed to supporting during their renewed royal service. "Your Royal Highness," came a familiar voice as the Rwandan foreign minister approached Harry with a warm smile. "It is wonderful to see you and the Duchess back in service. Our girls' education program has been awaiting your return with great anticipation." Harry shook hands warmly with the minister, remembering the meaningful work they had accomplished together before his departure from royal duties. "Minister, the pleasure is mine. Meghan and I are excited to resume our work on educational initiatives across the Commonwealth. We believe strongly that educating young women is one of the most powerful tools for global development." The conversation continued with detailed discussions about expanding educational programs, establishing scholarship funds, and leveraging royal patronage to attract international investment in African educational infrastructure. These were the substantive discussions that Harry had missed during his years away from royal service, conversations where his position could translate directly into improved lives for people across the Commonwealth. Across the ballroom, Meghan was engaged in equally meaningful dialogue with a group of Canadian Indigenous leaders who had traveled to London specifically for this reception. Her work with Indigenous communities had been one of her most passionate projects during her brief first tenure as a working royal, and the leaders had expressed genuine enthusiasm about her return to active service. "Duchess, your advocacy for our communities during your previous royal service made a real difference," said Chief Sarah Blackwolf, a prominent leader from British Columbia. "Our young people still speak about your visit to our schools and the scholarship program you helped establish. We are honored to have you back in a position where you can continue that work." Meghan smiled warmly, remembering the powerful connection she had made during her work with Indigenous communities. "Chief Blackwolf, that work was some of the most fulfilling of my life. I'm excited to expand our efforts and ensure that Indigenous voices are heard at the highest levels of Commonwealth decision-making." The evening's formal program included presentations from several charitable organizations that had received renewed royal patronage since Harry and Meghan's return. The military veterans charity that had been established using the trust fund provision for rejected candidates had been particularly successful, and its directors spoke movingly about the impact of royal support on their work with wounded service members. "Ladies and gentlemen," the charity director addressed the gathered crowd, "when their Royal Highnesses chose to return to service, they brought with them not just their royal platform, but years of experience working independently on these issues. Their understanding of both traditional royal service and modern charitable work has been invaluable to our mission." Prince William and Catherine, who had been instrumental in facilitating Harry and Meghan's smooth reintegration into royal duties, stood near the front of the ballroom, their presence symbolizing the family unity that the Queen had hoped to achieve with her final provisions. The relationship between the two couples had required careful nurturing over the past months, with honest conversations about past hurts and shared commitments to putting royal service above personal grievances. The process had not always been easy, but both couples had recognized that their success in serving the Commonwealth required them to work together effectively. Seeing them back in their element, William murmured to Catherine as they watched Harry and Meghan engage with the international guests, "It's clear that grandmother was right about their potential for service. They bring something unique to the royal role that we couldn't provide alone." Catherine nodded, remembering the collaborative projects they had worked on together during Harry and Meghan's first period of royal service. "They have a natural ability to connect with people from different backgrounds, to make royal service feel accessible and relevant to modern audiences. The monarchy is stronger with them as part of it." As the evening progressed, Harry found himself in conversation with Sir Malcolm Richardson, the elderly solicitor who had delivered the Queen's final conditions 6 months earlier. The old man's eyes twinkled with satisfaction as he observed the successful fulfillment of his late client's final strategic masterstroke. "Sir Malcolm," Harry said warmly, "I owe you an apology for my initial reaction to grandmother's conditions. I thought they were impossibly demanding. I understand now that she was providing us with exactly the structure we needed to succeed." Sir Malcolm smiled, his weathered face creasing with pleasure. "Your grandmother knew you better than you knew yourself, sir. She understood that you needed not just an invitation to return, but a framework that would ensure your success. The conditions weren't obstacles, they were guidelines for building the life of service she knew you were capable of living. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Archie and Lilibet, who had been brought down from the family quarters to say goodnight to their parents. Both children had adapted remarkably well to their new transatlantic lifestyle, spending their school terms at a progressive London school that welcomed their unique background while maintaining their connections to their California friends during holidays. "Daddy, when do we go home to California?" Archie asked, still adjusting to the concept of having homes in two countries. "In 3 weeks, buddy," Harry replied, lifting his son for a hug. "We'll spend Christmas there with Grandma Doria, and then we'll come back after New Year's for the Commonwealth Education Conference." The children's easy acceptance of their dual citizenship lifestyle had been one of the unexpected successes of their return to royal service. Rather than feeling torn between two worlds, Archie and Lilibet had embraced their unique position as bridges between American and British culture. As the evening reached its formal conclusion with King Charles delivering remarks about the renewed commitment to Commonwealth service, Harry felt a deep sense of satisfaction about the choice they had made to accept his grandmother's final offer. "Tonight represents more than just a return to royal service," Charles said, addressing the distinguished gathering. "It represents the fulfillment of Her late Majesty's vision for a monarchy that serves all peoples of the Commonwealth with dedication, innovation, and unwavering commitment to making a positive difference in the world." The King's words carried special meaning as Harry reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The Queen's final gambit had achieved exactly what she had hoped, not just the return of Harry and Meghan to royal service, but their return as more experienced, more committed, and more effective servants of the Commonwealth. Later that evening, as the last guests departed and the palace staff began the process of returning the ballroom to its normal state, Harry and Meghan found themselves alone on the palace balcony where they had stood for their first public appearance as a married couple years earlier. "Do you think we made the right choice?" Meghan asked, looking out over the London skyline that sparkled with city lights. Harry considered the question carefully, thinking about all they had given up and all they had gained by accepting his grandmother's conditions. "I think we made the only choice that honored both our personal happiness and our public duty. Granny understood that we needed both to be truly fulfilled." The past 6 months had demonstrated that their return to royal service was sustainable in ways their first attempt had not been. The financial security provided by the trust fund had eliminated many of the pressures that had previously complicated their royal role, while their years of independent experience had given them confidence and perspective that made them more effective in their service. "The children seem genuinely happy," Meghan observed, referring to Archie and Lilibet's adaptation to their new lifestyle. "They love having 2 homes, 2 sets of friends, 2 different educational experiences. I think they're going to grow up with a global perspective that will serve them well." Harry smiled, thinking about his children's enthusiastic embrace of their unique position. They had inherited their parents' ability to bridge different worlds, to feel comfortable in diverse settings, and to understand service as both privilege and responsibility. "The Queen's Trust Fund provision expires in 6 months, Harry said, referring to the 1-year deadline his grandmother had established for accepting her conditions. "By then, we'll have proved that we can fulfill all her requirements. The cottage and fund will become permanently ours." The prospect of permanent security and confirmed royal status represented the final validation of their decision to return. They had successfully navigated the challenges of resumed royal service while maintaining their personal happiness and family unity. "I've been thinking about expanding our work into climate change advocacy," Meghan said, outlining ideas that had been developing during their recent travels. "The Commonwealth nations are particularly vulnerable to climate impacts, and royal advocacy could help mobilize international support for adaptation and mitigation programs." Harry nodded enthusiastically, recognizing in her words the same passion for meaningful service that had originally drawn them both to royal duty. "The platform we have now, combined with our experience working independently on these issues, gives us unprecedented ability to make a real difference." As they returned inside the palace, passing through corridors lined with portraits of previous monarchs who had served the crown during their own historical challenges, Harry felt connected to a tradition of service that stretched back centuries while remaining vibrantly relevant to contemporary global challenges. The Queen's final strategy had succeeded beyond even her probably optimistic expectations. Not only had she achieved the family reconciliation she had hoped for, but she had created a framework for royal service that was both traditional and innovative, both personally fulfilling and publicly beneficial. 6 months after accepting his grandmother's final conditions, Harry understood that she had given him something far more valuable than money or property. She had given him a path back to purpose, a way to serve that honored both his heritage and his convictions, and a foundation for building the life of meaningful service that had always been his deepest aspiration. The Sussex family's return to royal service represented not just personal redemption, but institutional renewal. They had brought back to the monarchy a fresh perspective, international experience, and commitment to service that strengthened the institution while honoring its finest traditions. As London settled into the quiet hours after midnight, Prince Harry stood in the cottage at Frogmore that had become the symbol of second chances and renewed commitments, knowing that his grandmother's final gift had been the wisdom to show him the way home.